How about them Indians?
Quotation.
They're doing great. They're doing great.
The exciting team is filling their new home at Jacobs Field and filling their fans with dreams of a championship. They're playing much better ball than anyone expected this late in the season. Of course, we diehard Indian fans have waited a long, long time for the Tribe to win another pennant. There have been precious few in the 125-year history of this storied franchise. Only 3 American League championships and just 2 world titles, to be exact. And they weren't always known as the Indians. When the franchise was formed in 1869, they were called the Forest Cities. Later, the Broncos, the Blues, the Naps after player-manager Napoleon LaJoie, and then the Spiders, so named, we're told, because most of the players were tall and thin with gangly arms and legs. It wasn't until 1915 that they became the Cleveland Indians, named in honor of Louis Chief Sockalexis, the first American Indian to play Major League Baseball. He roamed the outfield for Cleveland at the turn of the century. It was at their first home, Old League Park, that the Indians finally won their first world championship, beating Brooklyn in 1920. It is just a shell of itself now as it stands in ghostly silence at 66th and Lexington.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Cleveland, hello. No, that's not Larry King. That's your pal, Tim Hanlon. How are you? This is Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. And I thank you for finding us. And yes, indeed, we have pointed our GPS coordinates to Cleveland, Ohio, that gigantic and very influential city in the northern part of the great state of Ohio. And we're going to get into one of the palaces of sports in Cleveland's history this week with our guest, Ken Krsolovic, about, in particular, League Park, the baseball and football park, and frankly, other events as well. That was literally the crown jewel of professional sports in Cleveland from 1891 to 1946. Primarily, of course, well and best known as the home of the Cleveland Indians, and in latter years, a shared home with Cleveland's Municipal Stadium. Not uncommon, by the way, to see the Cleveland Indians playing day games during the week at League Park in Cleveland, and weekends holding down the fort at Municipal Stadium for much larger crowds, and even some lights in case of evening games. And interesting little footnote, as we'll hear in our conversation with Ken Krsolovic in a few seconds, League Park, before its demise in 1946, was, I believe, the last Major League Baseball park to not have lights. As the years went on, the stadium basically came to its demise before lights even came into the picture. Although, as you'll hear in our chat, there were some temporary lighting situations that occurred, mostly from some of the Negro League play, as we'll get into, because League Park, not only the home of the Indians, but for listeners of this show, was also the home for years of a bunch of teams in both baseball and football that are no longer with us, that we like to kind of obsess about here on this little show. You know, the League Park dates all the way back to some of the earliest days of pro baseball in the U.S. in the 1890s. For example, the Cleveland Spiders of the National League were one of the original, not one of the original, but certainly one of the earliest teams in pro baseball. But as we mentioned, the Buckeyes of the Negro National League called League Park in Cleveland home, and actually that's where some of the actual night games that were played at League Park actually occurred, albeit not with permanent lighting. We'll get into some of that in a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes. The football, though, legacy of League Park, quite substantial. The Tigers, the Cleveland Tigers of the very first 2 to 3 years of the National Football League, back when it was known as the the American Professional Football Association. Yeah, you get your acronym straight. I'd try. At least I'm giving it a try. The Association for Professional Foot. No, the American Foot, the APFA, for God's sakes. Let's call it that, right? But now, of course, the NFL has gone back and absorbed those early years when it was named as such. Even they couldn't keep the right name intact, so they just made that part of the original NFL. But the Tigers, indeed, were part of that in Cleveland, and they played in League Park. And we get into some of that, as well as the Cleveland Indians and or Bulldogs, depending on the year you're asking. In the 20s was another NFL franchise that kind of took over after the Tigers fell apart in 1923. They played at League Park, as did probably more famously and more memorably for successor generations that may be still alive listening to this little show, the Rams, the Cleveland Rams, who obviously absconded for Los Angeles after the 1945 season. And we had a couple of episodes devoted to that. By all means, give a listen for those. But that's all part of the history of League Park. Our conversational topic this week with our guest, Ken Krsolovic, coming up for your enjoyment in just a few moments. And of course, though, before we get into that, we got to pay some bills, and we're going to do so with one of our favorite sponsors, of course, and that's our friends at oldschoolshirts.com. And that's P.F. Wilson and his friends in Cincinnati, just down the road from our topic this week in Cleveland. The promo code there for you at oldschoolshirts.com is Good Seats. Good Seats. Yes, that's the promo code. You're going to get 10% off all of your purchases at oldschoolshirts.com. And like the name implies, a tremendous array of great logoed T-shirts, high quality, distressed looking, and it's not just teams and leagues of sports franchises no longer with us, but a whole hefty amount of pop culture places, radio stations, amusement parks, stores, and ice cream parlor, you name it, all kinds of stuff memorialized. There is a page devoted to Cleveland there that you can enjoy and find all kinds of great Cleveland memories in T-shirt form. And of course, in particular, as it relates to this show, a shirt devoted to the Cleveland League Park experience. That is the League Park T-shirt. It's a beautiful red shirt. It's got a great image of the dimensions of what the old League Park used to look like. It's a great piece. And again, you're going to get 10% off that and all of your great purchases at oldschoolshirts.com, promo code Good Seats. Make sure that you check out the League Park shirt, as well as the dozens and dozens of other great shirts, not only commemorating the great history of Cleveland, but also all kinds of other teams and leagues and places across the United States and Canada. And again, that's oldschoolshirts.com, promo code Good Seats, 10% off all of your purchases. Enjoy it, by all means, on us and our friends at oldschoolshirts.com. We thank them and you for listening further to our great conversation with Ken Krsolovic as we talk about the old times of Cleveland's League Park, coming up. Have a little background on you, what your background is, who you are, and sort of how you stumbled across the story of League Park and why you wanted to go deep into a book about it.
Right. Tim, I grew up in Cleveland, Cleveland suburbs, and was fascinated with baseball from the time I was, could watch it on TV and whatever. And the first game I ever went to, ironically, was not in Cleveland. It was at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. I think I was 7 years old, and my family was there on a vacation for something, and got to go to a game. And we were in a downtown hotel. We took a cab over, and we got out of the cab, and my dad got out of the cab, and he looked up, and he goes, "Geez, this is just like League Park when I was a kid." And that was the first time I think I realized League Park existed. And then when I found out as I grew up that there were remnants of it still there and a ball field still there, I was fascinated by it. I loved going to the old Cleveland Municipal Stadium then growing up, and always had a curiosity about League Park. And there had never been a comprehensive book written. And I always said, I was a journalism major. I worked in college athletics, and I started out as a sports information guy, a public relations type, and always had that interest. And I wound up getting hired at John Carroll University in Cleveland. And the year I got hired, I was just out of college, and I was playing summer softball, and there was a guy on my team that similarly liked old stadiums and whatnot. And we got to be pals, wound up going to games a couple times, different places, and he also was kind of fascinated by League Park. And we always said, someday we should write this. And, he winds up getting married. I wind up getting married. You have kids, We always talked about it. We stayed friends, even though I had left town for a couple different positions. We stayed good friends, and eventually I wound up back in the greater Cleveland area. We reconnected, and Brian Fritz, who wound up being the co-author of this, said, you got to meet me downtown for lunch one day here. I got something to show you. And so this was probably about 2007 or 8. I met him downtown at the famous Slyman's in Cleveland, where they have the best corned beef sandwiches. And he pulled out this envelope of a bunch of anecdotes, little paragraphs written, different stuff. He had been going for about a year down to the downtown Cleveland Library, which has a fabulous sports area. It is unbelievable, their collection. Well, he had been going down and going through the microfilm of newspapers and just kind of skimming and reading and coming up with little bits and pieces and stories. And he hands this to me in this envelope and says, well, we've been talking about it forever. Here it is. I've got stuff. And I went, whoa, and started to sort through it. And it took us about 6 or 7 years on and off working on it and adding to as we went. And came up with tons of great stories. We dispelled a lot of things. There's plenty of these anthology books with all kinds of ballparks and a couple pages on each. And the same mistakes wound up over and over in these books. And they were perpetuated. And we corrected some of them, found some great stories, and weaved it together into what became the book, League Park, Historic Home of Cleveland Baseball.
So walk us through a little bit of the process, right? So library, of course, so you're going back in time, right? So this is more of a, I'm going to guess, more of a secondary source look back in time, historical versus first person memories and that kind of stuff. But were there anybody? Right. Was there any sort of any direct people involved in some of the stories, maybe from the Cleveland Indians organization, or were there any sort of people still alive of any kind of note in this process, or was this all an historical kind of investigation and dig?
There weren't any decision makers. We kept trying to find people, and we came up with lots of people who said, "Oh, I'll never forget riding the trolley down to League Park with my grandpa or my father or my mother or whatever and going to ball games." And we had that same story from, a couple dozen people. There was no one left really that was a decision maker or was involved with the actual building or whatnot. So really everything we did came out of research. It came out of, again, combing newspapers, which Brian did the most of, generated a lot of anecdotes and these little stories and things that we were able to come up with and that make not only the book, but we do like PowerPoint presentations and whatnot. We did a thing at the Indians Tribe Fest for a ton of people. And, those kind of things are what really makes the story. And the fact that League Park, I think, has an inordinate amount of amazing things that happened there. It's just incredible how much the history of baseball and sports and whatnot and significant things that happened all seem to kind of weave around League Park one way or the other. It was amazing to realize that. And in fact, the working title of the book was In a League of Its Own, because we felt like it was so unique that so many crazy things happened there, and significant things, Ruth's 500th home run, some big ones, the 56th game of DiMaggio's hitting streak, et cetera. There were some big ones that happened there, but then a lot of these other things that kind of what you're interested in that tied in with the Federal League and the early days of the NFL and the Cleveland Rams, and it just crisscrossed over all of these various areas and was amazingly interesting. Well, the publisher didn't like that title. They said, no one's going to know what that means. They said, just League Park. Okay, that's what we wound up with. And the ironic thing was, to find a publisher, that was new to me. I'd worked in as a writer and whatnot as part of my career and college athletics. But I distinctly remember calling a fellow that was at one of the Philadelphia papers. I had worked in Philadelphia for a while, that I knew that had a couple books published. And I said, hey, how did you find your publisher? And he said, well, what's the book? I told him a little about it, and he said, he says, it sounds like a great topic, really interesting. He goes, nobody's going to publish it, and no one's going to read it. I'm like, what? He goes, they're all dead. He goes, there's nobody around, and 80-year-old people don't buy books. Well, we, thank goodness, found a publisher, McFarland, that takes a lot of this kind of stuff, and the response has been just the opposite of what he said. We have gotten tons of great response, thank goodness. After, you were coming down the stretch of a 6 or 7 year project and somebody tells you no one's going to print it and no one's going to read it, my heart sunk. But it did get printed. And again, we have been, going around to various libraries, Italian American clubs, whatever, all kinds of different speaking engagements, and get great feedback.
Well, look, it also does have some connection to current sports lineage, right? And we're big fans of sort of the used to be here on this little show, and if you consider yourself I guess now a Los Angeles Rams fan, right? I mean, how many people want to go back and trace it back? But the Cleveland Rams, without them, you wouldn't have any Los Angeles or St. Louis or Los Angeles again or St. Louis again Rams. And the Indians, of course, right? One of the legacy teams dating all the way back to the origination of the American League, right? Didn't just pick up one day and start playing at the Jake, or what used to be called the
right.
Jake.
And National League ball before that was at League Park.
Exactly.
And the Spiders, who you've had a special show on just on them in the past.
So let's start with the Spiders, because this League Park, right, was essentially built for them. I don't want to say exclusively, but with them in mind, right?
No, it was exclusively for them. Frank Robison was the owner of the team. He also owned streetcar lines in the city. They were not public transportation is just that today. It's public. In those days, it was privately owned lines. They paid for the rights to build streetcar lines on the city streets. So Robison owned the team, and he owned some streetcar lines, and the ballpark that he had, I believe it was at 40th and Payne, wasn't very good. I think there was a tree in deep dead center field, and, it was a goofy park and didn't really work. And he spied some land a little further east, which at that time, was, not packed with homes or whatnot yet. And he picked up a block of land, and that's pretty much how the footprint of these ballparks in those days came to be. And so he did pick one out wisely that happened to be where his streetcar lines intersected. So not only would he get your nickel to get there, but then he would get you to buy a ticket as well. So he got you, I guess you could literally say, coming and going.
Well, that's especially interesting because we also try to look for some themes here, and the intersection between professional sports and real estate, right, is absolutely a major concentric configuration, because you look at, say, what's going on with Major League Soccer right now, right, and the must-have soccer-specific stadiums as part of the mix, and what the Atlanta Braves have done by basically moving out of the heart of the city into the suburbs and basically, plopping their ball field literally in the midst of a mixed-use development of office buildings and restaurants and theme kind of situations and stuff. So in some respects, this is almost a glimpse, frankly, of the necessary or the dual relationship between that of real estate and the pro sports team, and in this kind of fashion.
Well, and in Cleveland, again, League Park ties in to what set the stage for municipal investment into teams, beginning with Cleveland Municipal Stadium on the lakefront in the early 1930s. And so that story of League Park and Municipal Stadium, built in 31, the Indians owned League Park. The city invested, the first time that ever happened, that a city invested in a ballpark and said, well, we're going to build this and the team's going to come here. Well, as soon as they finished the ballpark, the Indians didn't move in the middle of the 1931 season. They said, well, we own League Park. Why are we going to pay you rent and play down there? So it took them a year to come to an agreement to get the Indians to move down to the lakefront, middle of 32. they played the rest of that season and had a lease to play all of 33. At the end of the 33 season, the Indians said, we've had 3 crowds here in a year and a half that wouldn't have fit into League Park. So they said, we're going back. And they moved back to League Park, which was still there and still in pretty good shape. In fact, they invested some money in it, added some seats and painted everything up. And in 1934, the Indians were back at League Park. So that whole thing, though, that happened set the stage for what you're talking about. Not only real estate, but cities investing to get teams. And the struggle that went on in Cleveland from the 30s, the early 30s until 1947 is an amazing story in itself before they finally took all the games to Cleveland Stadium.
It's interesting. All right, before we get to that sort of that back and forth, let's delve into the Spiders for a second, because the original park was made of wood, as most of the stadiums were at that time in the late 1800s, right? We don't necessarily go through the entire history of the Spiders, but a pretty interesting club, especially in their last season in 1899. Maybe you can kind of describe a little bit of sort of the futility of that, but maybe how successful, or maybe then ultimately not, the Spiders were with this brand new park.
Yeah, Robison moves the Spiders to this new park he builds. You're right, wooden, in 1891. Moves the team there. Opening day pitcher is Cy Young for the Cleveland Spiders. And the Spiders, not great, didn't draw great the first couple of years there, but by the mid-1890s, they became pretty good. Went to the Temple Cup, which was, there was only the National League at that stretch, so they came up with a playoff system, and the Spiders went to the Temple Cup, 1895, 1896. Meanwhile, Robison, he's pretty frustrated because, as many cities had, they had Sunday blue laws. No games could be played on Sunday. He got angrier and angrier because now he's putting a good team on the field. His attendance went up some, but not to what he thought it should be, and he thought the solution would be Sunday baseball. He tried going out, just to the edge of the city, went to the amusement park, Euclid Beach Park, played a couple games there, played in Newburgh Heights, just on the south side outside of the city limits, tried a couple of things and was in a constant fight. Well, it never worked. It never paid off. And he got more and more frustrated. So by the end of the 1898 season, he came up with a different plan. He and his brother invested into the St. Louis team and what they called syndicate baseball. You could never do this nowadays, have 2 competing teams, supposedly, but common ownership. So in 1899, the Robisons take all the best players from Cleveland and trade, and that would be in air quotes, they trade the best players from Cleveland all to St. Louis and trade all the worst players from St. Louis over to Cleveland. So Cleveland has an absolutely miserable team, wins, what was it, 134 losses. In fact, they lost 40 of their last 41 games. Worst team in Major League history, of course, but no fault of Cleveland's or whatever. It was really the spite of Robison at that time to do this to the franchise.
Yeah, and you St. Louis Cardinals fans out there should know that this was the 1899 St. Louis Perfectos, and they are part of the lineage of the St. Louis Cardinals that we know today.
Correct. So at the end of the 1899 season, there were 12 teams in the National League. There had been for about a decade. And Cleveland was one of the 4 that they kind of got rid of. So it's down to 8 teams, and League Park would have been vacant, except that in 1900, there was the American League beginning to form, and it was a minor league in 1900, but it had designs on challenging the National League. So Robison unloaded League Park to the new owners that came in with this new team. It was a minor league team. They were called the Cleveland Lake Shores in 1900. But in 1901, They declared that they were going to be a major league instead of being a only Midwest-based league. Many of the franchises shifted east, and they went head-to-head with an 8-team circuit to go up ahead against the National League.
Yeah, and so ironically, the damage was done, right? You sort of kind of blow up the team that was in Cleveland, and almost in many respects had a fresh start with this new American League circa 1901.
Exactly, and so Cleveland got into that league and wound up having a pretty good run there early on, especially when Nap Lajoie came over from Philadelphia, because he tried to jump from the Phillies to the new Athletics in the American League. There was a court injunction. The Phillies said, we have him under contract. We have a reserve clause. He can't leave. And a court in Philadelphia agreed. What the American League did then was in 1902, they sent Lajoie to Cleveland. So Cleveland picks up perhaps the greatest player of that time, kind of on a fluke. And while the court battle was raging that year, Lajoie could not play when the Cleveland club went to play the Athletics in Philadelphia. If he was in Pennsylvania, he could have been arrested. So the team would go to Philadelphia. He would take the train down through West Virginia, across Maryland, and go to Atlantic City and hang out for a couple days. Well, the team was playing the series in Philadelphia. Then he'd catch up with them after. Then it finally got settled in 1903, and Lajoie could play full-time, and that's when Lajoie became the player-manager of the Cleveland club, and they named the team. He was so popular, they called them the Naps.
Yeah, and if you want to hear the Philadelphia A's side of that story, you can go to our episode number 21 with our conversation with David Jordan. But that's an interesting component there of his story. I mean, the fact that he basically has to carve out a little detour for himself before the club because he can't go lest he get into bigger trouble. Well, all right, so let's explain that then the rest of the aughts, right? Because by the end of that decade, the notion of a wooden ballpark, right, is clearly getting long in the tooth across all of baseball.
Exactly.
And so maybe you can give our audience a sense of sort of when and how the next generation of league park construction was sort of brought about.
Well, in 1908, plans went in place for Shibe Park in Philadelphia and Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. They opened brand new in 1909. Cleveland wanted to get on the bandwagon and have a concrete and steel ballpark like that. There was also actually in 1909, there was one other park was in Toledo for the minor league team there. Well, that was built by Osborne Engineering of Cleveland. So the owners of the Indians at that time in 1909 went and said, all right, we want in on this. We want to reconstruct, take down the wooden structure, and build a new ballpark on the same site. And that's what happened. Cleveland winds up with a concrete and steel ballpark that opens on opening day of 1910. Oh, and a bit of irony. Opening day pitcher, Cy Young, who had opened the ballpark in 1891 with the Spiders, was the opening day pitcher. He was back in Cleveland after some years in Boston, was back in Cleveland and opened the ballpark a second time. Pretty unbelievable to think of that.
That's interesting. So, so the idea of these concrete and steel structures were, so how long did it take to build that stadium, right? Because there was no interruption between the 1909 wooden league park and the 1910 concrete and steel league park, right? Right.
Well, for the 1909 season, the structure that's at the corner of 66 and Lexington, which is the team offices and the ticket windows and whatnot, was built. It was built in 09. So that was there beforehand. And the old configuration, the ticket windows were at the corner of 66 and Linwood. So just on the north block, north corner of the block. Well, when they rebuilt this, they put the ticket window on that, what would be the right field corner, that signature building, which still exists to this day. And after the day after the final game in 1909, workers came and dismantled the wooden stadium. And the ballpark was in place and ready to go opening day 1910.
Well, that's pretty well thought out, right? You'd think that it would take longer and would be a bit of a messier process back then, but that's
especially in that era, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
But they pulled it off. Cleveland's got the new ballpark, and it was a rave. Drew rave reviews. Now, it was the grandstand that went essentially right field corner to left field corner. The bleachers in left field stayed intact from the old ballpark. Those did get rebuilt eventually, and more seats were added in that corner in the lower deck, come around another decade, 1920.
Obviously, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the Indians, although they're obviously very integral to this story. But it's an interesting little sidebar. A couple of years later, you sort of alluded to it before, but maybe we can sort of talk about it now. So there was this upstart circa 1914, 1915 called the Federal League, and we've had a couple of episodes devoted to that league and what that was all about and the reasons behind it. But the league park had a significant role actually when it came to Cleveland and its possible play in the Federal League. You want to sort of walk audience through sort of what happened there?
Yeah, not much different than in 1900 when this upstart league, the American League, came to be. They were, a minor league circuit for that 1 year, then declared themselves a major league in 1901 and started raiding the rosters of the National League. Same thing happens come this Federal League group. They have a league called the United States League in 1913. It operates as a minor league. They put a franchise in Cleveland. It plays at what was called Luna Park, which was actually an amusement park, but did have a grandstand and whatnot for football and baseball. And that's where that team played in the 1913 season. Well, the owner of the ball club, Charles Summers at the time, he was, panicking. There's another threat to my business. So what he did was he took his top minor league club. He moved the Toledo team to Cleveland for 1914 so that there would be a game at League Park every day, either the Cleveland club or this Toledo club transplanted to Cleveland. And so if there was a competing team, if the Federal League had chosen to put a team in Cleveland, they would always be going head-to-head with another contest. So that's how it got Cleveland into this. And really, Cleveland, it was badly hurt, though, by the league. With two teams playing, the teams were not successful. The attendance was down for both. And Summers got into real financial trouble and wound up unloading the team after the 1915 season.
Now, that's interesting. So in many respects, the idea to sort of backstop and try to prevent the Federal League from sort of invading Cleveland, the wounds were actually a bit more self-inflicted by bringing in a minor league team to fill in all the other dates around to sort of and hasten the demise of the current ownership of the current team.
It definitely hurt them. That whole league, again, you look at the Federal League standings, there's no Cleveland club, but there was this behind-the-scenes story going on in Cleveland, and yeah, it had a huge impact on the franchise.
And there were two nom de plumes of the Toledo Mud Hens when they were playing those 2 seasons in Cleveland. What were they? That's not a quiz, I can tell you. They were apparently
there were the Bearcats 1 year.
Yeah, and then they were the Spiders, which were reviving the old.
That's right.
Original.
Yeah, exactly. They thought it would be a good marketing move to revive the name Spiders because it did tie into the history of the city in baseball. But ironically, we did find different references of nicknames based on the teams or based on the newspaper. So, like when they did Bearcats, some used other names. There were a couple names that went around that year. So it was a unique situation.
So that's very interesting. So ironically, the Federal League wound up actually compromising what was going on in baseball in the city of Cleveland, never even played a game there. That's interesting.
Without question, yes.
All right, so let's go into the 20s then, because the team owner of the Indians by that time is a guy named, who's this Sonny Jim Dunn guy, and why did he decide to rename the park in his honor? Well,
he renamed the park in his honor. He bought the team in 1916. And again, the 14 and 15 teams were not good. Dunn comes in. He acquires Tris Speaker. Huge move to get Speaker out of Boston. Comes to Cleveland, becomes the player manager, and the upswing starts. So Cleveland has, competitive teams in the teens, and culminates with the 1920 World Series and that championship. And again, you talk about firsts and crazy things that happened. The first ever Grand Slam in a World Series, first home run by a pitcher in a World Series, unassisted triple play, the only one, of course, in a World Series ever. And they were all in the same game, Game 5 in Cleveland in League Park. So an amazing, again, confluence of things that happened there. It just is incredible. And, Sonny Jim Dunn buys the team. But again, one of those things that we saw in many of the books. Oh, well, he bought the team in 1916 and then it became Dunfield. Totally untrue. Some people may have referred to it as Dunfield because he was the owner. Not uncommon. It was Griffith Stadium, Ebbets Field, etc. A lot of ballparks were named after their owners. In fact, before Dunn bought the team, a lot of people called League Park Summers Field because Charles Summers was the owner, or Summers Park actually. But it never was officially Summers Park. It was always League Park. When Dunn bought it, it was still League Park. But he promised to bring a championship to Cleveland. So after the 1920 World Series victory, Dunn declared, he said, okay, now we can name it Dunn Field. And so the truth is that it was named Dunn Field, but it was only from 1921. He passed in about 1923 or 24. His widow owned the franchise for a couple of more years. So it was in 1927. Then after that season, when she unloads the team, then it goes back to officially being League Park. But again, the locals really called it League Park way more than they ever called it Dunn Field.
All right, that's interesting. Okay, so which you can understand, right? That's sort of the, I guess you could say, the owner's prerogative, right?
Absolutely. Turner Field, whatever. It goes on to this day. Jacobs Field, when they opened in '94 with the new park here in Cleveland, Dick Jacobs was the owner at the time. So not unusual ever in the history of baseball.
All right, we're going to take a quick, brief pause, and we want to remind you that our friends at Audible are offering to you, our listeners, an opportunity to get a free audiobook download from their amazing array of over 190,000 titles to choose from. When you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats, and that's the place to go to get your free audiobook download, courtesy of us and Audible. And it's something you can cancel at any time, and you can keep the book for as long as your device exists. And like I said before, there's just a ton of choices available to you to burn up that free credit, including a bunch in the realm of our forgotten sports little genre here, including in the realm of basketball. If you fancy yourself a fan of the old ABA, for example, 2 great books on the great Julius Erving that might be worth using your credit for. One, of course, is the Rise and Rise of Julius Erving. It's called Doc, and it's written by Vincent Milazzi and narrated by David Cromet. You could use your credit for that book, and it's a great sort of interview style background on the life and times of Dr. J from all sides. But if that's not good enough for you, why not try the autobiography? It's called Dr. J, the Autobiography, of course. It's written by Dr. J in concert with Carl Greenfeld. And it's narrated by Dr. J himself, Julius Erving. And you could use your credit for that book, as well as, like I said, thousands and thousands of other books, not just only in basketball and basketball history, but in a whole host of genres and topics. By all means, give them a try. Why don't you? It's risk-free, for God's sakes. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Yes, audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the link. And that's where you're going to get your free audiobook download. Again, you can cancel at any time. And once you do download that book for free, and after you cancel it, if you choose to do that, it's yours to keep. So you can enjoy in perpetuity, for as long as your device lives, the downloaded book free and gratis, courtesy of yours truly here at Good Seats Still Available and our friends at Audible. Thank you, Audible. We appreciate it. And we appreciate you joining our conversation once again. All right. Well, it's also around this time where the earliest days of professional football in the United States was starting to make itself kind of known, ragtag as it might be. And we've had plenty of episodes kind of devoted to the sort of the primordial ooze of what then ultimately became the NFL. But Cleveland was no stranger to those beginnings and early years of the NFL. Do you want to kind of revel a bit in how the NFL and League Park kind of intersected?
Well, pretty good timing because 1920. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the National Football League. The NFL was founded in Canton, in a building that was a car dealership, was where the meeting was. So Northeast Ohio was huge. The Canton Bulldogs, the Cleveland team was actually nicknamed the Bulldogs at the same time for one stretch there. There was a team in Akron, the Akron Pros. This was a hotbed. The NFL really, its roots are in the Midwest, from Green Bay and Decatur and, those towns, Portsmouth, Ohio, and on the Ohio River. The Midwest was the beginnings of pro football. So Cleveland, again, right in the midst of this. And where are you going to go if you're going to play pro football in the 20s? Well, there was really one good choice, and that was League Park. And with its odd configuration, which was short porch down the right field line, it was more of a rectangular, ballpark. So it really did serve football well. And Cleveland had, again, a variety of teams that came in and out over those years in these early years of NFL football. And again, some of the competing teams too, because there were a couple of different incarnations of the AFL. I'm sure that was one of your episodes as well.
Sure. So the Tigers, quote unquote, were the first ones in the true first 2 or maybe even 2 years of the National Football League. I guess the NFL, let's be clear, the NFL named itself such in 1922, but the 2 years prior, known as the American Professional Football Association, but that technically is part of the NFL's original history and lineage, and the Tigers were absolutely one of those first franchises playing in League Park.
Correct. And, the history of football in League Park does predate that because it became the site for big high school games. There was an annual Thanksgiving Day game there. What was called the Big Four in Cleveland, 4 colleges, Case Tech, Western Reserve, John Carroll, and Baldwin Wallace. That was a big deal in Cleveland, those 4 schools. And so many of those games head-to-head, and some of the games when they played outside teams were also played at League Park. So the football history at League Park does predate pro football, but also went simultaneous with the pro teams, really all the way till the end of League Park's life as a stadium.
So what was the relationship of the early, and we'll get to the Rams in a minute because that's a sort of a different sort of ball of wax, I think. But based on your research, what was the sort of relationship between the park and the Cleveland Indians as owners of the park with, say, the Cleveland Tigers in those first couple of years of the NFL, and then the Indians football / Bulldogs of the NFL in the latter part of the 20s? Was it a rented, ownership kind of thing where they paid rent, these football teams, or was there any financial relationships, or was there any friction, say in terms of dates and usage of the field and chewing it up and all that kind of stuff, especially when this
I'm not aware of any financial dealings with the Indians ownership and the football teams. That I'm not aware of it. I guess it's possible, but as I understood it, it was always a rental situation. But clearly, Major League Baseball and the Indians, took dibs on the field, because there were years where if there was an early season game and the Indians were still playing, that an early season football game may be played at Akron or somewhere else, instead of tearing up the baseball field at that point. So that happened a couple of different times and football really didn't take grips until October.
When the Rams come about, and obviously there was a bit of a murky sort of a birth of them, right? Having played in the Second American Football League in 1936 and then
Correct.
Then in the NFL itself in 1937, all the way, I guess, until 45, but they took a year off for 43. It was during the war and all that stuff. We talked about that in certain other episodes. But so, as the Rams come into play at League Park, it's a little uncertain to me as to why perhaps that they, were in League Park versus, say, Municipal Stadium, which was built when?
Well, Municipal Stadium opened in 31.
Okay.
So it was already well established by the time the Rams came in 36. But again, the rent was higher. It's 80,000 seats. Did the NFL in the late 30s need 80,000 seats? And the answer is no. They didn't need it, and it was more cost effective to play at League Park. So again, the city of Cleveland was extremely frustrated with this situation. They had spent, gobs of money, almost $3 million in the early 30s. Sounds like nothing today. You can build a good scoreboard. You can't even get a good scoreboard for $3 million. But in those days, it was a huge investment. And here they are frustrated. They couldn't get the Indians in there full time. They couldn't get pro football in there full time. They're filling it with, all kinds of events to try and, show that it was a good investment for the taxpayers. But I'm sure that they were very frustrated, and it was an ongoing fight between the ballpark at League Park and the city owning Cleveland Municipal Stadium. So, yes, the Rams decide to play at first at League Park, and in fact, they went a year to what was a high school stadium, was a huge high school stadium, somewhere around 18,000 seats, but they went there for a year. Again, it was negotiating, and 18,000 seats was enough. They did wind up playing a couple of seasons at Cleveland Stadium, but again, the crowds didn't warrant the cost, the higher rent to play down there, and they wound up back for their last few years of existence back at League Park once again, and that's where they won the championship in their last year, I should say. But the interesting thing was they had that great year in 45. The war is closing down, troops are coming back, pro sports is really taking off, and all of a sudden they wanted to, in 45, they wanted to move games from League Park down to Cleveland Stadium because they knew they could sell more seats than League Park had. Problem was they had a lease, and they were stuck playing at League Park for the 45 season, had a couple of huge crowds in there. And then finally for the championship game, which wound up being, of course, their last game before moving to L.A., was at Cleveland Stadium because the lease didn't cover the potential of a playoff or a championship game. So the Rams, were able to negotiate a deal to play that one game, the championship, in late December of 45 at Cleveland Stadium. But there was lots going on then because the new Browns had already been announced. They had, the great owners set up to come in and have his team there, and Paul Brown I'm talking about, and the Rams couldn't get a lease to go down to the stadium at that point because the Browns now had a lease. They beat them to the punch and had a lease for 46 at the stadium. Meanwhile, quarterback Bob Waterfield of the Rams was out of Southern California. He had a Hollywood wife in Jane Russell, and so the owner of the Rams said, I'm going to L.A. Well, actually, the NFL blocked the move at first because they said, it's going to cost us a ton of money. And he said, I'll pay the difference of what it would have got you to Cleveland and send your teams to L.A. to play us. And that's really how that deal came about with the Rams moving. Had it not been Waterfield, had it not been Jane Russell, Cleveland might have had two NFL teams. They might have had the Rams playing at League Park, and they might have had the Browns down at the lakefront.
And for you completists out there, you want to check out our other episodes, perfectly timed, with Jim Selecki and Andy Piasek on both the Rams and those last couple of years, and then the move to L.A., and the Browns coming in from the AAFC and arguably being perhaps one of the greatest dynasties of pro football. So very interesting that League Park saw its share of quality. So what were, you have some really cool pictures in this book of sort of the, of how some of the different layouts and stuff. There's a press box, looks like a temporary press box, and how the Rams sort of used League Park. But any indication as to how much reconfiguration or fan inconveniences or seating arrangement changes that might have gone down because of playing of gridiron football versus baseball in that stadium? Because it wasn't built for football per se, right?
Correct, absolutely. But again, because of the layout, because of the block that Mr. Robison picked out, and because of those trolley lines in 1890, it did work well for football. The third base line double-deck grandstand, went right along the field. It was an awesome view. And what they did was, of course, if folks that aren't familiar with League Park, the right field had a high wall similar to the Green Monster at Fenway. Well, that ran along, behind that other sideline. Well, there was that whole area of what would be right field there. Yeah, and you're right. They did build they would put a temporary press box for the Rams games that would be a kind of against the wall. And in front of that, there were, they would bring in temporary bleachers so that there was seating on both sides of the field. So, and in fact, there was one time where, some of the bleachers collapsed and they kept the game right on going. There was some accommodations made for football. Absolutely.
All right. I don't want to miss out on another part of the baseball story here, right? And that's the Negro Leagues, and in particular, the Cleveland Buckeyes, who were very much an integral part of League Park during the 1940s. And now this is my presumption, so tell me if I'm off base on this or not. It seems to me that the Indians, right, as the owners of League Park, seem to kind of show more than just a few dalliances towards Municipal Stadium as the years progressed in the late 30s and then into the 40s. It seemed like there were more and more games, whether they be weekend games or I guess the occasional night game, right? Because League Park was never, this is an interesting piece of trivia, right? It was never lighted permanently. And I think it was the last park to be played in Major League Baseball that never had lights.
Well, Wrigley, of course, went until
fair enough.
Until the 80s.
That went on and is no longer with, right. I was still with
right.
It, but
right.
But it seems to me that the Negro Leagues and in particular the Buckeyes team, am I correct in assuming that they kind of saw a gap as the Indians started to kind of cast their eye elsewhere besides League Park, and they decided to fill that, or is it just different market altogether?
Well, again, remember, they owned League Park, so they had this trump card, in negotiations with the city. Every time they would go back to the city and they'd say, we don't want to pay you this much rent. Okay, we'll only take these games there. So they started to make, wise financial decisions. What happened was after the Indians had moved out, we touched on this earlier, after the 33 season, 34, they play all their games back at League Park. Comes 35, all the games are at League Park. But in 1933, they started something called the All-Star Game in Chicago at Comiskey Park. Well, in 35, they awarded the game to Cleveland. And, of course, Major League Baseball said 80,000 seats. We're going to take the All-Star Game there, not to League Park. And the Indians, the light bulb went on above their heads. They said, wait a minute, we don't have to take all our games there. They sold out. They saw that this All-Star Game sold out and made all this money. So the next year in 36, they said, well, we're going to take a Sunday game against the Yankees down there and see how we do. So they promote the game, and they draw 60-some thousand people. That's filling League Park, 2.5 times at least, and they made that gate on one day. So it's all about the money, folks. It's pro sports, whether it's the teens, the 20s, or the next century here. It's about the bucks. So Cleveland decides to start taking key games, especially Sunday games, down to Cleveland Stadium. In 39, they install lights. Lights had started at Crosley Field, I believe 35 or 36. They put lights, the city of Cleveland puts lights in the stadium, so now Cleveland starts to take some games away from League Park on weekdays as well, playing an occasional night game down at the big ballpark. So Cleveland Stadium, and that fight between League Park and Cleveland Stadium continues, but you're right, more and more games kind of make their way over time to the big ballpark because it becomes more financially viable.
So the Indians are basically the owners and getting paid by the Buckeyes, and I guess other entities too, right? As the landlord, right? So
certainly within their within their realm, they own the ballpark, and they still want to get the most value they can out of it. So yeah, they're renting to the Buckeyes. Western Reserve University, one of those Big Four teams we mentioned, they were making a stab at trying to go big time in college football at that time. They scheduled Pitt, West Virginia, some bigger, more named teams trying to elevate their program. So they're playing at League Park. So it was within, certainly something that the Indians, it's a good business for them to make money off this piece of property that they own, and again, to the dismay of the city of Cleveland. So it wasn't until Bill Veeck bought the team during the 46th season that tide finally turned, and after the 46th season, Veeck negotiates a deal to take all the games back down to the big stadium for the 47th season. Again, the Bossard family is the grounds crew. Now they're taking care of the stadium. Well, they kept on taking care of League Park too, because the Buckeyes are playing there and there's football going on there every fall as well. So, the Indians have an investment. They have a piece of property. You can't just shut it down, and, they needed to make some money off it. So it was fortunate for them. And in fact, there was a time where they did talk about, the Buckeyes talked about adding lights to League Park, because they were paying $2,500 per game if they played a night game at Cleveland Stadium. That was their rental charge. Well, the lights were $10,000 and the installation was $5,000. So in 6 games, they could get their investment back. Well, it never happened. They never did put the lights in. And of course, the decline, another story for you, the decline of the Negro Leagues after the integration of the major leagues in 47. So Negro League baseball, really dropped off, and fans didn't want to go. They wanted to go see Jackie Robinson play. They wanted to go see Satchel Paige play with the Indians and Larry Doby play with the Indians. So that was the demise not only of the Negro Leagues, but ultimately became the final demise of League Park.
Yeah, that's ironic that and Satchel Paige obviously made plenty of treks to League Park to compete against the Buckeyes and wound up then being part of Veeck's team in 48 playing for the Indians across town. So, but it's also interesting too, as you discuss the Negro Leagues and the Buckeyes, which had a very interesting history, mostly 43 through 48 and a couple of dalliances in Cincinnati and Louisville along the way. But there's an interesting picture on if you're reading at home, chapter 6, page 134. There's a very interesting picture there of League Park circa 1949. And it's amazing to see all of the housing and other construction that now by that time had surrounded the park. I mean, it literally looks like it's, sticking out like a sore thumb amidst all this other megalopolisness, if that's a word. And
You're right.
You could see how tight and or how constrained, I guess it was, right, in terms of its maybe ability to do more and be more as the years went on for other sports and other events.
Well, again, remember in the 1890s when that lot was picked, there were not private automobiles. You got there by trolley or your horse or you walked or whatever. So, yeah, as the ballpark grew and that area around it grew, it was not conducive to parking. And there were, people made, a quarter a car parking, and they would squeeze as many cars on their front lawn as they could. And that's what that neighborhood was. And you're right, 49, that picture you're referring to, an aerial view where you can see it was just jam-packed with, there were some businesses and of course, plenty of housing. But once League Park went out, once that 1950 season, the last year of the Buckeyes, they fooled mid-year, and a new owner gets the team from Veeck, signs a deal to stay at the stadium, and part of the deal, to the city's relief, is finally the deal includes that the city takes over the space that is League Park and says, all right, that's going to be the city will own this. And what they did was they began to dismantle it then that winter of 50-51.
Before we sort of get into what it is now and sort of its legacy, what other things went on at that park besides baseball and football? What kind of events? What kind of concerts? Just other things? Because obviously, despite having Municipal Stadium there since the 30s, the League Park was probably one of the prime venues in the city and metropolitan area of Cleveland for, I guess, any other event or spectacle, right? Things like boxing and those kinds of things.
Absolutely. Boxing was big there. Really wasn't much else in terms of concerts or anything. We did come across, since the book was published, we came across in 1916, there was an opera held at League Park. The Siegfried Opera took the field space and was presented in League Park. But you're right. If there was going to be a big gathering, that was by far the biggest space in Cleveland prior to prior to Municipal Stadium being built. Now, there was the indoor public hall, which got built in the 20s downtown indoors and became a boxing venue and a basketball venue. But indoors was different. The biggest outdoor space was League Park until, Cleveland Stadium came about in 1931.
So its demise and its memory, right? So it has become, what is it now? I don't live in the Cleveland area, but it was denoted as a National Historic Landmark, right? Wasn't it along the way somewhere?
Yes, and that was in 79. There were several attempts to try and revive this because, again, the area around League Park after the team left, that became, a really downtrodden area. A lot of the housing became, vacant. It was not a good area of the city by any means over the next several decades. It really was in decline. But there were a lot of people with nostalgia for the park, and the leader, honestly, being a fellow named Hal Lebowitz, who was the sports editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. He had been at the Cleveland News before that, went out of business in 1960. He wound up at the Plain Dealer as the sports editor and really longed for the place. And in 79, there was the first effort to try and say, hey, there's still this field here, because, again, the city took it over as a park. And kind of unusual, Evetts Field gets plowed under and they build apartment buildings, and Forbes Field winds up on Pitt's campus because it's right there, and et cetera, et cetera. None of these places, or very few, would survive, certainly not as a ballpark. But there was a ball field there, and that in the 50s and in the 60s, it was largely used by a lot of the Cleveland high schools. The premier games, they left some of the seating up, and it was supposed to be the premier area. They actually built a city pool at one point down in one of the down the left field corner. There was a basketball court down the right field corner. That's how this place miraculously survived all of these years. And Mr. Lebowitz at the Plain Dealer decided he kind of got behind. There was an effort to try and do something. And so he really trumped it up with a couple of columns in the Plain Dealer. They had a big to-do, invited some old players back. I was just into college, and I went down there. They had a celebration on a day, and Bill Wamsgans, the fellow who turned the unassisted triple play in 1920, he's standing out there describing on the field how he did it. What a cool day it was. And it raised a little bit of money, but not nearly enough to do what the hope was, and really the effort fell apart. There was a councilman from that area of Cleveland, a woman named Fannie Lewis, who then took over the charge later into the 90s and whatnot and said, we need to do something with this. There's all this history, all of these famous people and things and that occurred there. And so she kept pushing. Unfortunately, she passed right before the city finally did come up with funding to completely renovate the field. They put all new fencing, recreated the famous right field wall, which is, again, higher than the one at Fenway Park. So they did a recreation of the wall, and now you can go on that field and play on the exact spot where Cy Young towed the rubber and Bob Feller did. And you can stand in the batter's box where Ruth hit the 500th home run over that famous wall. And that is all there today. And then that ticket office and office building, 2-story building on the corner in what was right field, that survived as well. That was used, it was used as a kind of a community center and whatnot. It had gotten pretty beat up and run down, but the building still was there, and they fixed it up. And the city made the investment to fix that structure. Now there is a museum there. A fellow named Bob Zimmer had a fantastic collection of baseball memorabilia, and what he calls the Baseball Heritage Museum is now in that building, and he has a lot of League Park items, but also things his interest is in, whether it's Dominican baseball and Mexican league and Negro leagues. So he has lots of different things like that. And of course, even amateur baseball in Cleveland, which was huge back in the 19-teens. There's tributes to that and whatnot. So it's really it's a small museum, but it's very, very cool. Definitely worth seeing. And again, ties into this whole aura of history when you walk on that area and think, oh my gosh, what all has happened here? And you can still picture it. And that's what's really cool.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I guess one last question is how much, if anything, do the Indians pay homage to the field at all in their current iteration, or is it pretty much in their rearview window at this point?
Well, I would say the Indians have been supportive of the ballpark, of League Park. Major League Baseball this year has reserved League Park for the week leading up to the All-Star game this summer. They haven't announced what's going to go on there, but there are so many things going on in Cleveland this year. The All-Star game has become really a whole week-long festival. So there will be something going on down there. But the Indians have been very supportive, and they do a pretty good job of honoring their history. They have a neat in Progressive Field now. There's a very cool outdoor area with plaques and whatnot. In fact, a plaque that hung at League Park honoring the 1920 season and the death of the Indians shortstop at that time that hung in League Park is now in that area at Progressive Field. So that area and what they have done is very makes great recognition of League Park. In fact, if you go around on the concourse in the lower deck, just to the third base side past home plate, and if you look closely at the concession stands that are there, they are built in tribute to League Park. They have brick archways. There are large paintings of ball players from that era. There are a couple of plaques that represent some of the stories that happened at League Park. So they really have done a great job of recognizing their history. And inside the park and out, they have the statues and whatnot outside. It really, I give the Indians organization great kudos for the things they have done.
Well, so there it is. There's the admonition to our listeners is if you're considering going to Cleveland this year for the baseball All-Star game and all the festivities, you owe it to yourself to go check out the old and still there League Park, or the remnants thereof, as well as what's remembered in Progressive Field. And I'm sure Ken will be more than happy to autograph purchased copies of his book as you go back in time. And explore and see for yourself all these great little tidbits that we've frankly just scratched the surface with in our conversation today. Ken, this has been pretty cool. You want to give us a little bit of promotional goodness for the book, which, by the way, I have to say is very well written. It's very tightly put together. The pictures are tremendous. They seem to. You've got even an interesting thing in the appendix. We were talking before about the renamed, at least for a few years, Dunn Field. In the appendix there in the back, there is literally the seemingly ahead of its time season ticket brochure that describes in great detail, including scenes of what your seats will look like depending on where you're sitting. It's beautifully reproduced, and it's just it is about as comprehensive a book I have seen dedicated to a particular stadium. So kudos. But how can our listeners find it, and what else do you have up your sleeve maybe beyond this book?
Well, it's easy to find. If you type in League Park book, it'll come up. It's officially League Park, Historic Home of Cleveland Baseball. But it'll come up. My name, Ken Krsolovic, and my co-author, Brian Fritz, are the authors of the book. And it was published by McFarland. You can get it straight through the McFarland website. They're out of North Carolina. But it's on, the usuals, Amazon, et cetera, Barnes & Noble. You can find it on most of those places. It'll come up at lots of different bookstore sites. It also is available at that museum at League Park itself. It's available there. They use the book as a way to raise donations. So it comes with a donation to the museum. In fact, it's free entrance to see the museum, but they do ask for donations, and if you make a donation of a certain amount, you get the book. And I'm down there sometimes. So yeah, if I'm there, I'm happy to sign it. Brian and I, again, we do lots of speaking engagements and whatnot. So it's easy to find. If you give it a little look, you'll come across our book. Also, if you're interested in League Park, I run a Twitter site that's League Park CLE, and we post. This book could have never come to an end because we keep finding more great pictures and little tidbits and stories and different things come up. So when we find that kind of stuff, that's where it goes. It goes on the Twitter site. So we'll find a new picture that we've never seen before. We'll post it. We'll put the information. We denote famous dates in League Park history, et cetera, et cetera. I'm amazed at how it just continues to add followers of our site. So League Park CLE on Twitter, if you're interested in old ballparks in general and League Park in particular, we have lots of stuff on there all the time. And just try and tie it to whatever's going on. And we've come up with some neat things. We didn't even talk about, a lot of the famous events. 1911, the first purported All-Star game took place at League Park after the death of Addie Joss, unfortunate death of a great Cleveland pitcher who's now in the Hall of Fame. And in 1911, they had a fundraiser for his family, and the American League All-Stars played against the Indians in 1911 at League Park. So that's outlined there. It just goes on and on. And again, the anecdotes, the little tidbit stories, the crazy, funny things that happen down there, we have plenty of them inside the book.
All right, well, save it for the book that people need to buy, and we appreciate all this. And I was only half joking, I guess. Apparently, that Ken will be out there and about, and with Sharpie in hand, and I guess he'll sign copies if And I think, look, that's maybe also a cool, maybe even better way to buy the book. Obviously, we'll have a link to it on our website and all that kind of stuff. And of course, we always enjoy when people, click on the link and give us a couple of shekels, keep our episodes going. But what better way, frankly, than to more genuinely buy it actually at the park itself? It's such part of the story and stuff. So, look, I wish you continued success with it. And I also appreciate your squeezing some time in between your umpiring duties to talk to me about this book.
Among other things.
Yeah, and among other things, I'm sure. And I hope a few other books get sold because of this thing. I learned a lot, and I haven't been to Cleveland in a while, but obviously next time I go, I will make it an effort to go and actually see this because it's still there, which is rare to say. You can't say that about a lot of former ballparks with all this great history that are actually still, in some form or fashion, somewhat close to original incarnation.
There's a couple. Tiger Stadium now has a field there. Memorial Stadium in Baltimore, there's a field on that spot. But again, this goes back to 1891. So it is purportedly the oldest major league field that is still in operation, where you can still go to and play baseball on that site.
All right, our thanks to Ken Krsolovic for a wonderful discussion about the history of Cleveland baseball, League Park, Cleveland football for that matter, and a bunch of other teams that we can now at least put a small little check mark next to that we've talked about, and hopefully we'll go deeper as the months and, God forbid, years go on. The book, of course, is called League Park, Historic Home of Cleveland Baseball, 1891 to 1946. It is written by Ken Krsolovic and his co-author, Brian Fritz. It is published by our friends at McFarland and Company. And, of course, you can find that wherever good books are sold. But, of course, we encourage you to buy the book through the direct link you will find on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode about League Park and Ken and our conversation of which, and in there you will find a link to the book. And by doing so, you'll give us a few shekels when you do so. And again, that's goodseatsstillavailable.com. That is the locus for all kinds of information about the show, what we're doing, what we're up to, what we've done in the past. My God, we've got over 110 episodes now. So by all means, give a chance to listen and download and link to whatever you want to do with all those episodes. They're all yours for you. And hopefully you enjoy them and weigh in with your commentary. And you can also send us email from the site. You can send us... you can sign up for our newsletter, which we send out each and every week. And, of course, you're going to find all of our social media links there as well. And, again, if you're on Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. If you're on Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. And if you're on Facebook, you'll find a page devoted to us there, too, for God's sakes. There's no shortage of ways to follow and or interact with us here at the show, and we encourage you and appreciate you doing so in all of those many different forms. We also want to send our thanks and a tip of our Cleveland Indians or Spiders or whatever baseball cap to our pal Jerry Payne, who, of course, this week has gone through hell and high water to make sure that my rough and jagged edged pieces are nicely and smoothly put together into something comprehensible. And he, of course, at Podfly Productions, the experts in helping podcasters do what they do. Check them out at podfly.net. Thank you tremendously for listening this far. We look forward to talking to you in the next couple of weeks. And for now, the box office is closed. Take care, everybody.